Just one human. I can scare him off. Alaric was just about to approach Chester to scare him, but before he could, Kryptina quickly pulled him back into the bushes with the other vampires. Then all of a sudden, Chester popped his head up as he heard the bushes rattling. He turned to the bushes where Kryptina, Alaric, and the other vampires were hiding in. Chester lifted a brow, and he slowly began to approach the bushes, and as he slowly reached his hand into the bushes, he found a small piece of white fur stuck in between the vines. He slowly took it out and sniffed it. He turned away and threw the white ball of fur onto the ground. "Shh! That was a close one," Kryptina sighed with relief. "What are you so scared of?" Alaric took her hands off his face. "We had a school of vampires with us, remember?" Alaric said, resting his hands on his hips. They all got out of the bushes. Alaric landed on top of Kryptina. The vampires looked around with excitement. They haven't been out of the castle a while since Alaric's parents went missing. "No!" Alaric made fists. "I told you. We can't go out when the sun's rising up." He rested his hand on his face for a second. "Go back to the school." He points back at the castle. "Aw, man!" All the vampires sighed, leaving Alaric and Kryptina alone. "So is that a painting of you and your parents back in the castle?" "Of course. You sure I don't look like my father at least?" He rested his hands on his hips and got off of her. "Listen," Kryptina got up and looked at Alaric. "I'm not supposed to be here. I gotta get back." She looks around the grass. "Oh, thank Dracula, 'cause my Aunt Death is mad to get rid of you." He takes her hand. "Wait." She shakes her hand off of his. "Why?" "I can't let you come back here." He ties a blindfold on her and grabs her hand again. "It's secret. If Oxblood or my parents see you, they will have you for dinner for sure." "No, wait." Kryptina kneels on the ground, moving her hands around the grass. "I need my crossbow and wooden stake back." Alaric smirks at her. "What do you need that for? Shooting your cat again?" "No!" Kryptina turns away, crossing her arms. "Shooting... Oh, never mind." She waves her hand and crosses her arms again. Just then, they suddenly heard a painful cry in the forest. They both popped their heads up. "That sounded bad," Kryptina said with worry. "We have to see what's going on." Alaric said, "You hear a bloodthirsty cry, and you run towards it?" Kryptina lifted the blindfold. "The only way to stop trouble is to understand it. Let's go." They both rushed off as the blindfold fell off Kryptina's head, leaving it behind. They suddenly stopped running as they saw a little ball of fur caught in a trap. They both slowly stepped towards it to see a mother wolf lying there, dead, and a wolf pup crying as its paw was stuck in a trap. The mother wolf and wolf pup had brown ragged fur. The mother and wolf pup were skin and bone, and their fur was even torn apart, leaving some bald spots on them. "Alaric, what are we going to do? We won't be able to bring him back to the city in time, and I don't have my first aid kit with me." Kryptina rested her hand on the sad and hungry little wolf pup. She always remembered she wanted to be a vampire slayer like her brother, but is this really what she will have to go through to end them? Kryptina didn't like seeing others get hurt as it is. "Well, I know of another way, but I won't even have enough time to do it," Alaric said with sorrow. "But we can't just leave him." Kryptina kneeled down, patting the wolf pup. "If we do, he'll die." A tear fell down her face. "I know." Alaric looked around the forest. He then lifts his finger and turns his head to think. "There's only one other way I can save him." Alaric narrows his eyes, seeing how hurt Kryptina and the wolf pup are. "Kryptina, you may want to look away." Kryptina turned away. She couldn't bear to see what he was going to do. Was he going to kill the wolf pup or what? "Okay, you can look now." As Kryptina turned to look at the wolf pup, she then noticed it was just lying there on the ground with a small piece of blood on his neck. "Shh! He's asleep," Alaric said, lifting his finger. "He kind of reminds me of my old pet Komodo dragon, Pokey." He giggled. "You had a pet Komodo dragon named Pokey?" Kryptina asked. "Yes, but that was a little while ago. I set him free and, well, I never saw him again," Alaric said, resting his finger on his chin. Alaric and Cryptina sat on a tree. Alaric picked up cockroaches and began eating them. He then drank from a small bottle filled with blood in it. No one can catch me, human girl. He drops the bottle onto a vampire trap, causing the trap to close shut. I used to do whatever I wanted back in London. I played with my friends and helped my brother get food. Now he wants me to stay in the city and work as a librarian in the castle all the time. Stay here in the forest. Alec transforms into a bat and flies under a tree branch hanging there. It's nice. No one ever bothers you unless it's ox blood. Cryptina turns to him with confusion, lifting a brow. Ox blood? Who's ox blood? Only my annoying teacher, Alaric said, rolling his eyes. He flies back on top of the tree branch and transforms back into himself. He always says humans are undisciplined, untrustworthy, and improper to join a real vampire school. Cryptina looks at him, beginning to smirk. Your teacher sounds like he's got a whole tree stuck up his butt. She giggled. Stop it! Alaric gently hits her. It's not funny, he giggled. Oh, yes, I can see the look on your face. He definitely does. She smirks, resting her hand on his shoulder. The Lord Protector! Cryptina looked at Alaric with worry. Alaric! Cryptina grabbed him by the shoulders. He wants the vampires dead. Gone. Alaric, you have to leave. She slightly shakes him. We were leaving. Alaric took her hands off his shoulders. He narrowed his eyes and crossed his arms. Then what stopped you? Your parents? Cryptina asked. Yes, but they left. Alaric grabbed an ant and munched on it. In their bat form? Cryptina leaned in. Yes, it's just me, them, and the rest of the whole school. He frowned as he hunched. But I'm sure it's an even better castle, with no humans around to bother us. It's gonna be amazing. He laid down on the tree branch. But what if they got caught? Cryptina looked at him with worry. No! He narrows his eyes and throws the bag on the ground. No one can catch my parents, and if they were caught by those city humans, I will get my vampires to suck the blood out of them. Well, don't worry. Wherever they are, we will find them. Cryptina smiles, getting up and leaped off the tree branch. Well, I guess I'm off then, Cryptina said with a smile, taking out a bat amulet, and she put it around his neck. Alaric lifted the amulet, giving it a look. He then smiles to himself with a blush. My city is right there. Cryptina points at the city. Thank you so much for helping me get back. I always liked to hear about vampires and vampire stories, but I never knew for sure if they existed or not. She smiled at him, trying not to let her feelings show. You're quite welcome, and don't worry about the wolf pup. He'll be up again in no time. He turned away with his cheeks beginning to turn red. Scare you later, Alaric said as he hissed at the sheep, causing them to run away. Cryptina exits the meadow, entering the city. Not if I scare you first, Cryptina said with a smile. He hissed with a smirk and quickly leaps into the trees. Cryptina turns with a smile, crossing her arms. You know I can still see you, right? Alaric looks at her, beginning to feel like he was burnt to a crisp. No you can't. He leaps into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Cryptina walked by the small group of boys staring at her with curiosity. Where does she go every night? One of the boys asked, holding up a wooden cage. We should keep a close eye on her because something's not right. Danny rested his hand on his chin, lifting a brow. The blue moon shined brightly in the sky. Lydia sat down on a bench outside reading a book. She smiled with delight, enjoying her book, until all of a sudden Klaus leaped out in front of her, holding 6 red roses in his hands. For you, my little mosquito. He smirks, giving her the roses, and reaches out his hand to her. Lydia lifted a brow, putting her book down on the bench. Didn't I tell you to get lost the other night? Oh, yours is a tough love, but please forgive me. Klaus crawls down to her with a smirk. No matter how hard I try, I just can't stay away. Klaus leaned on her. Lydia sighed with annoyance, moving away from him. Okay, fine. What do you want? She rolls her eyes. Well, there was a blood fest going on, and I was wondering if you would be interested in joining me for the fun. He leans in with a smirk. Fine, but if I do this, will you promise to leave me alone? "Oh yes, my little thorn bush, I promise." Klaus puts his hands together, smiling with delight as if he was going to trick Oxblood. "I must take my leave now, but I'll be back soon." He quickly rushes off, transforming into a bat and flying away. Lydia turned to see if he was still there, but he was nowhere in sight. "Did you get it ready?" Alaric giggled, sitting down behind Klaus, ready for class. "Oh, you bet I did," he giggled. They both smiled at one another. Thorn was sitting on the other side of the room reading a book. Duke was sitting behind her, looking at himself in a mirror, only seeing nothing. Henderson sat behind Alaric, trying to study. Alaric and Klaus both giggled as they saw the door opening, and they looked to see it was Oxblood slowly opening the door. "Alaric? Pumpkinfiend? What are you two laughing about now?" He lifted a brow with confusion. Just then, as he opened the door more, a bucket of water fell onto his head, causing him to fall onto the ground. He rose his head. Thorn gasped as Duke and Henderson laughed, pointing at Oxblood. Alaric! Pumpkinfiend!" Oxblood cried with anger. Alaric and Klaus looked at one another and quickly ran out of the room as if they were being chased by vampire hunters. Kryptina laid in her bed, beginning to feel as if she had a terrible virus. She began to toss and turn. She then tried gasping for air as she began to dream, seeing herself inside a dark and spooky castle. She saw a red path of scent flying in the air. She slowly began to follow it. She then noticed a small group of vampires at a table having a feast. There was a long mirror on the wall where the table and the vampires were at. Kryptina noticed a young vampire girl. But before she could get a closer look at them all, she suddenly felt someone shaking her and calling her name. "Kryptina! Kryptina!" What? Kryptina opened her eyes to see it was her brother Chester looking at her with worry. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I think that's the question for you." Chester rested his hand on her cheek. "You felt like you were going to freeze to death, and you almost looked as if you weren't going to wake up at all." Chester hugged her with worry. "Chester, I'm fine." Kryptina hugged him back. "Well, I don't want you going to the castle and to the library to work today." Chester gets off her bed. "You scared me half to death." "I'm sorry, Chester, and happy Halloween." "Happy Halloween to you too, Kryptina. I will get your ghost costume ready later, and hopefully Anastasia and I will see you later." Chester smiles, closing the door. The full blue moon began to rise as Kryptina was wearing her ghost costume. It was a white dress and a long white cloak that went with it. As she walked towards the library, she could suddenly hear things so clearly from a faraway distance. She heard Danny and his friends talking from a distance. "Ha ha! I'll teach that Lord Protector some manners of my own," he said with a laugh. On the other side of the city, she heard two women talking. "So I heard the Lord Protector has a surprise for us tomorrow." "Oh yeah, I was told about that," the other woman went on. Kryptina could sense the food being made for the Halloween celebration. Steak, fruits, veggies. Their drinks were water and wine. Kryptina's mouth watered, feeling hungry and thirsty. Kryptina could clearly see her two friends from the other side of the street. Anastasia was wearing her witch costume. It was a black costume with black stripes on the long socks with orange on it. Her belt was orange with sparkles. Her witch hat was black with an orange belt on it. Harold was still locked up in a pillory. He was wearing his Frankenstein mask. The mask was green with black scars on it, and the eyes were red. "Boo! I scared you, right?" "Not even," Lydia said, walking by them wearing a black vampire costume. Her costume was all black, and her cloak was black with purple under it. She wore plastic fangs in her mouth. "Whoa," Harold said with surprise. "Oh, sure," Anastasia said, her eyes looking away from him. "Happy Halloween, you two," Kryptina said with a smile. "You too, and you look lovely." Anastasia smiled. "Are you ready?" Hey, Kryptina, did you know that Lydia is a real vampire?" Harold said with shock. Kryptina lifted a brow. "It's a costume, you moron!" Lydia steps in and hits him on the head with her book. Just then, people began to sing and dance all around the fire. Some people cheered while others either sat and watched, or some of them just played instruments. This would be as spooktacular if I wasn't so thirsty, Kryptina sighed. Don't worry, Anastasia rested her hand on her shoulder. We'll get you some water. I'll be right back. Anastasia heads over to the snack table. Lydia sat beside Kryptina. She turns to her with worry. Kryptina? Yes? Kryptina looks up at her. Are you okay? Yeah, why? Kryptina looked at her. It's just, you look pale, that's all. Lydia pointed at her. It's okay, I think I'll be fine, but thank you very much for caring about me. May I please have a hug before I go? Kryptina said with a smile. Okay, fine. Lydia narrowed her eyes, hoping no one will see them hugging. But make it quick. Kryptina hugs her with joy. As Kryptina hugged Lydia, she could suddenly smell a strange scent that made her smile to herself. She then suddenly began to feel ill again. She could smell so many strange scents of people, food, and drinks. She could hear others so clearly. She could see paths in the air sometimes. She then suddenly began to feel like she was going to faint. Hey, Lydia, I'm sorry, but I gotta go home. May you please let Anastasia know that? Kryptina quickly rushed home, leaving her friends behind. Fine? Lydia headed over to the feast table to tell Anastasia. The blue moon shined brightly in the sky as the people continued to celebrate Halloween, dancing around the fire. Kryptina entered her bedroom and laid down. Snowy leaped onto her bed and patted her paw on her face. Good to see you too, Snowy. Kryptina patted her until all of a sudden she suddenly found herself gasping for air. Snowy looked at her and patted her again, beginning to meow. Kryptina gasped and she began to cough for air. She continued to try gasping for air, and she felt as if someone was suffocating her. She felt so cold as if she was freezing up. She then suddenly began to lay back on her bed, and she slowly closed her eyes. She began to feel as cold as ice and shook to death as if she was in a snowstorm. That frightening moment suddenly ended when she opened her eyes, dreaming again. She saw she was standing right in the same hallway of a dark and spooky castle. The castle was very dark and gloomy. There was spider webs on the corners. There was a long carpet that led all the way to the kitchen. There was old statues of knights' armor on each side of the hallway. There was red banners with golden lines on the edges of it. She suddenly saw a long red scent that led all the way to the dining room. She slowly followed it with curiosity. She then noticed that same vampire family feasting on the table near that same long mirror. One of the adult vampires turned and welcomed her, lifting his finger, telling her to come over to them. The adult was a man vampire with long black hair and red eyes. He was dressed in all black. He was wearing a long black hat and he carried a staff with him. It's an honor to finally meet you. We've been waiting for you, he said with a smirk, holding out his hand to her. As Kryptina grabbed his hand and she slowly stepped towards them, she then noticed that same vampire girl she tried to see last night. All of a sudden, all of the vampires were dressed in black, all except for one, the little vampire girl. As she looked closer, her eyes almost leaped out of her head. The little vampire girl looked just like her except for her hair, eyes. She was wearing white neck ruffle and wrist ruffles. Her hair was a brown color and her eyes were red with dark circles around her eyes, while Kryptina's hair was a blonde color. Her eyes were blue. She didn't have dark circles and she wasn't wearing any ruffles. The vampire girl looked at her with a smirk. She was dressed in a white dress that almost looked like her costume. Her white cloak was torn at the bottom with saw-tooth edges. The center of her dress was black while the rest was all white. The vampire girl suddenly waved out her hands, causing the chair to move away from the table. She then pointed at her and pointed at the chair. The man vampire, dressed in all black, led her over to the table, and he let go of her hand. Kryptina sat down as one of the vampires was taking out a bottle filled with blood inside of it. One of the vampires poured blood in each of their glasses. The glasses were a silver color. One of the vampires stepped over and poured blood into Kryptina's glass. They then did cheers to one another. As Kryptina and the other vampires all lifted their glasses to drink, Kryptina noticed the vampire girl was still smirking at her as if she was gonna kill her. As they all drank and Kryptina lifted her glass and began to drink, she suddenly began to feel like she was turning cold as ice again, and she began to feel as if she was being stabbed in certain areas of her body. She slowly looked down at her nails, seeing them grow longer, and they began to turn black. She suddenly felt like there was food in her mouth, and she slowly covered her mouth with her hands, and she spit out what it was. Was there food in this blood or something? If not, then what? Kryptina's eyes widened with fear, and she shook for a second when she saw it was 4 of her teeth that fell out of her mouth. She then felt like she was being stabbed in 4 areas of her mouth. She looked at herself in the mirror again, noticing her eyes began to glow, turning a blood red color. Kryptina then shook with fear as she suddenly noticed herself smirking in the long mirror again with her eyes a blood red color. There was dark circles around her eyes. She had long fangs, pale skin, long black nails. She was wearing her costume, but her white cloak was suddenly had sawtooth edges. She was wearing a white neck ruffle, wrist ruffles, and her hair was a brown color, while the little vampire girl was nowhere in sight. She suddenly noticed that her reflection in the mirror began to fade. She then realized it was herself who she was meeting with at the table. With a blink of an eye, Kryptina woke up to see Snowy was there, lying right beside her, as if she was gonna leave her. Kryptina slowly leaned forward, still feeling as cold as ice. Snowy? She suddenly saw Snowy, and everything around her was so clearly. Everything looked a little green, but it was so bright as if the sun was up. I can see you so clearly, Kryptina patted Snowy. Snowy tilted her head and began meowing at her. She got up and headed towards the window, and she lifted her brow as she saw it was still nighttime, seeing that the Halloween party was almost over. What? Why is it that it's still nighttime, but yet I can see things so brightly now? She turned back to her lynx, Snowy, who was meowing at her, walking back and forth on her bed. I'll be right back, Snowy. Kryptina patted her, and she headed towards the bathroom and turned the light on. I almost forgot to brush my teeth. She got out her toothbrush and toothpaste. As she put the toothpaste on her brush, she immediately dropped her toothbrush and toothpaste as her eyes almost leaped out of her head. She shook with fear. She felt like she was going to scream as if she just saw a ghost. Kryptina realized she had no reflection in the mirror. What? Oh no, no. How could this happen? She said to herself, walking back and forth. I'm a vampire? She turned away from the mirror, resting her hands on her cheeks. There was so many vampire slaves all over the city. Her friend Harold joked about her becoming a vampire first, but then she remembered that Alaric fixed the bite. How could this happen if he fixed it? Did he do it wrong, or did he just do it too late? No way is she going to let anyone know about this, or she'll never hear the end of it. How can she fix this, and what is she going to do now? Kryptina walked back and forth, resting her hands on her face, feeling nervous until she suddenly heard footsteps from outside the door. She heard the front door open. She could clearly hear footsteps coming from down below.